So today I wanted to talk with you about spiritual gifts and what and who we are, what things we've been given by God from our very birth. So I thought that I'd start just by telling you who I am, in case you didn't know. I am an INFJ. I'm an oldest child. I'm a Virgo, and I was born in the year of the monkey on the Chinese zodiac. If I somehow found my way onto the Hogwarts Express and got sorted with a sorting hat, it's very likely I'd end up in the Hufflepuff house. And I'd like to tell you what Disney princess I am, but I don't know because I haven't taken that quiz yet. But someday I'll let you know. All of these things are fun, right? How many of you have taken one of the online quizzes at some point and found out what Star Wars character or whatever you are? They're good fun, and it's interesting to find out what you are. But today we're talking about something different, similar but different, and those are our spiritual gifts. So all season long during Lent, we've been looking at a book called The Disciples' Path, and in the back of that is an appendix that has a list of all the spiritual gifts. So if you don't have a Disciples' Path book, but you think, I'm not sure what the spiritual gifts are or which one I might have, pick one of these up. They're in the back on the trapezoid table there as you leave the sanctuary. And they've got a good description of each of the gifts. And as you read them, generally 1 or 2 or 12 of them will pop out at you. And you might say, I have that one. I'm sure I do. And that's good because God gives us all many, many gifts. One of the things we did as a staff and as a church council was to take what's called a shape test. You can find it at freeshapetest.com, and it helps you go through all of the aspects of your personality, your spiritual gifts, and what you're passionate about and what your personality is. So at any rate, as we think about these things, though, I want to tell you another story about a time when I was in a Bible study. This is before I went to seminary, and we were studying Philip Yancey's book, The Jesus I Never Knew. And as we looked at this book, one of the questions in the Leader's Guide was, what do you think Jesus' personality was? If Jesus were to take the Myers-Briggs personality typology, where would he come out? So all of the extroverts in the crowd, now you know extroverts, right? They are oral processors, and so they were right on it, and they said Jesus hung out with 12 people all the time. Clearly he was an extrovert. And Jesus was always eating dinner with various people. You know, when he was telling the story of the lost son and the lost sheep and the lost coin, he was eating. And when he was at Simon's house and he got washed and his feet anointed, he was eating. Clearly, Jesus is a party kind of guy. He was feeding 5,000 people and 7,000 people, and he was an extrovert, no doubt about it. Well, after the extroverts got done blurting out their answers, the introverts who'd been processing inwardly all of their stuff started talking, and they said, well, you know, before Jesus started his wild, crazy, extroverted ministry, he spent 40 days all alone in the quiet of the desert. And you know, it was, sure, he fed 5,000 people, but he was looking for a quiet place to go all by himself, right? And then after he fed those 5,000 people, he sent all of them away, including the disciples, and he went up on the mountain and he prayed in the quiet. And you know, on Holy Week, right before the worst moment of his life, what did he do to draw strength? He withdrew by himself in the garden. Clearly, Jesus was an introvert, right? As we were debating all of these things, there was one person in the group that said, you know what I think is interesting? I think it's interesting that we all found ourselves in Jesus. Isn't it amazing that all of the extroverts found something to relate to in Jesus, and all of the introverts found something to relate to in Jesus? And isn't it interesting that Jesus has all of these things? And if you were to go through the whole chart, all 16 personality traits on the Myers-Briggs or whatever other favorite profile you've got, it's very likely that you'd find Jesus there too. You know why? Because he's the author and the perfecter of our faith. Jesus is fully human, but also fully God. And as fully God, he's got all of the best of our personalities. And so we can all relate to who Jesus was. So then the question becomes not which gifts did Jesus have so that we could line up and say, look at me, I've got the same as Jesus, I'm the best. The question is, how did Jesus use the gifts that he had? And so for that, I want to tell you another story, one that you likely know well, from John 13. In John chapter 13, there is the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. Now, when I imagine this story, I sort of imagine the disciples arguing with maybe Peter, who was in charge, or John, who was in charge, trying to figure out who was going to take the role of this lowly servant. And I kind of imagine them in the corner whispering about who had the spiritual gift of foot washing. And I'm guessing that none of them wanted to claim that one. And they argued about who might have to do that. And Jesus, instead of listening to their complaints and their arguments, took the basin and the towel and said, I'm going to do it for you. Right? It doesn't matter who has the spiritual gift of foot washing. It matters who's willing to use it. And so Jesus knelt down and was humble before them. And he said this, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. You see, our spiritual gifts aren't just for us. It's not just so that you can take a quiz and post it on your Facebook wall and say, I have the spiritual gift of teaching or hospitality or mercy showing or whatever it is that you have. Our spiritual gifts are meant to be used. They're meant to be used in community to benefit and bless those around us. Jesus used his gifts to bless the disciples, and we are called to do the same. So now we come to this important question. Why do we need to use our spiritual gifts, or why do we need to serve? So each week we've said we need to ask ourselves why we have this topic, and how does it give us a closer walk? Like, how does it fulfill our Lenten theme? So in prayer we said, are we enjoying prayer? And in presence and community we said, am I expecting to see God when I'm in worship and in community? And last week we looked at giving, and we said, how can I be a cheerful giver and faithfully give in a way that brings God glory? Well, today I want to ask, how can we faithfully serve? How can we serve in a way that brings us joy? And maybe even more important, is serving something that draws us closer to God, or is it just something that we have to do, like a chore? Like, I got into Christ family and that was great, but now I have to feed the dog and feed the whatever and do all of the other chores. Well, you might guess, just in the way that I asked the question, I think the answer is that serving is really something that's beneficial for the soul. That serving is obviously about helping others and being part of the body of Christ, but serving also does something to us when we serve. So I want to tell you two quick stories about a service opportunity that I had when I was in seminary. I attended this church, and I found myself, I got the opportunity to work with a program called Food for the Soul. It was a Saturday night meal that we served to anyone who was in need. And so they all came, and we served them food, and then there was a worship service afterwards. And at this particular one night when I was there, I was in charge. I was assigned the hostess job that night. And so I went around and I greeted people. And I saw this one man who came in, and he had a book with him. And so as a book lover, I asked him, what are you reading? And he said, I'm reading Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina, I thought, good gracious, that's a hard book. Like, I read that book, sorta, and it was really hard to get through. And I couldn't believe, of all the books I would have imagined somebody to bring into that program, Anna Karenina would have been at the bottom of my list. And as I thought about that night when I went home, I thought, boy, God was really teaching me something here. That I had this puffed up hubris idea that I was better than the folks that I was serving, that I was somehow smarter or better read or whatever other silly things we sometimes think. And that moment taught me that I needed that job because it was teaching me about God's people. I didn't need that job so that I could make myself feel better about how good I was helping others. I needed that job because I needed to learn something about myself. One, that I wasn't as well read as I thought, and two, that I needed to help others, right? That other people were important too, and that we're all there in the body of Christ. And I think that that's what Paul is talking about in the letter to the Corinthians. As we read farther along after Pastor Don got done reading, if you read that whole chapter, it talks about how you can't cut off any one part of the body and say, I don't need you. You can't say, I don't need my toes or I don't need my sense of hearing. That we need all of the body works together to give gifts to one another. And so we need one another. The other lesson that I learned from that food program happened on a different night. Another one of my jobs at this program was at the end of the meal to hand out cakes and cupcakes and bread. We'd get them donated from the local grocery store, and they were the things that were about to go stale. And so we got them for free, and we'd hand them out to everybody. And so I'm standing there behind this table, and it's heaped with donuts and cakes and all sorts of things. And people are taking them, and I found myself starting to feel anxious, like, what if we run out? What if we don't have enough? And I started to get worried, and I looked down, and underneath the table, there's like boxes and boxes of stuff. And I suddenly realized, like, there's no way that we're going to run out. We could give twice as much as people are taking to everyone, and there'd still be more than enough. But sometimes in these moments when we feel anxious, God whispers something in our hearts. And God whispered something to me that day, which was, this is how my grace works. Not only did God reassure me that there's more than enough cakes and cupcakes and bread to give out to everybody, but also this is how grace works. That the more we give, the more we get. That God has more than enough, abundance after abundance to pour out and hand out to people. And I think sometimes we need serving in order to remind us that we receive very often in serving just as much as we get. And so service teaches us that we can't run out of God's grace. So service is good and it's important. It helps us to break our pride. It reminds us of Jesus, who knew that he didn't need to impress others with great deeds, but was willing to do the lowest job in order to show the world what it meant to give away God's love. Service helps us to see and think about the needs of others. But then we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we sometimes resist service? Because we all do it, right? We see the list of stuff in the connection and we think, oh, that Feed My Lambs program, that sure sounds nice. Hope somebody signs up for it. Not me, of course, but somebody. And there's something in us that is sometimes resistant to serving. And I want to think about that for a moment. I think that perhaps one of the reasons that we get stuck in service is that we think there maybe is only one kind of service. That the only kind of service that might be available to us is handing out food. And we think, I really don't like doing that. Certain kinds of food make me gag, or I don't like doing whatever. And we think, I have trouble serving food, so therefore I cannot serve anyone. And of course, that's not the case, right? God has all kinds of ways for us to serve. abundant ways for us to serve. I thought, as I was typing this, of the story of a woman I heard once who retired from teaching elementary school. She taught like second grade for her whole career. And she retired, and her church was ready for her to retire. She's one of these very active people, and the church was so ready. And they said, hey, would you sign up for teaching Sunday school? And she said no. And they said, hey, it's almost VBS time. We need a coordinator. Would you sign up for it? You're a teacher after all. And she said no. And they tried thing after thing to get her to sign up to help the kids. And she said, I really don't feel like God's calling me into working with kids anymore. I did that, and it was great. But I really feel a desire to help the elderly in our midst, and I want to go and start making prayer shawls and give the prayer shawls to people who are in the nursing home. That's where I really feel called. So she started doing that and serving through her passion. And it was a blessing, not just to the church and the people that received the shawls, but to everyone. Because when we serve with our heart and we serve with our passion and when we serve with our gifts, then God blesses those moments. We don't have to do the same thing forever. We serve with where God is calling us now. Which leads me to thinking about something that the authors in the Disciples Pathway book talked about. And that is the idea of divine discontent. That there are times and moments where we feel like we're just not quite right. That somehow it looks like I'm a goldfish, but I feel like I've got a higher calling, right? And that maybe there's somewhere else I'm meant to serve. And so this is what God does to us. Don, I think you can probably attest to this. Everyone I know who went to seminary said, I was doing a thing, but it felt like there's something missing. Like was something not quite right. And that is very often in those moments that aren't quite right where God is calling and pushing us to go somewhere new. So we serve.